I would like to learn more if Bitcoin is living up to its expectations technically. And for that, it would be interesting to understand the core players, their roles, their incentives, their responsibilities. So can you just start with giving a little bit of an insight? Who are the core players in the Bitcoin system?
Today, how
Today.
how this is ran,
Yes.
and how is the nodes and miners, and what is it?
Because it's always it's decentralized, it's
Yeah.
waterproof, and so live. Who is doing that?
Yeah, and to get a glimpse of the players in the ecosystem, set certain roles, and there is most of us have already heard about miners and probably also some node operators and hodlers and core developers. And there's certain roles that are around this ecosystem, and I will quickly give an overview about this role. Okay.
Cool.
So first and foremost, you have, and where the journey also started back then, you had a bunch of core developers, and they actually implemented the system. Yeah. Obviously, it's a software, it's an open source software. You can check out the code repository online. And this is where the journey started. And then someone actually took the code, compiled it on a local machine, and then he ran a node that was in the early January 29.
I think you need to do. What's a node?
Yeah, okay. Good. So a node is one instance of Bitcoin, which is running Bitcoin. Yeah. So a computer running the software Bitcoin.
Okay. Yeah.
This is, I think, the easiest definition of a node. And while running that node, you could also run or also operate a wallet, which holds your private keys.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to do that, but typically you do that. You can do it. At least it is recommended that your private wallets are connected to your own node. Yeah, and hence there are literally thousands of nodes replicating the relevant data. I'll come to the specific data structure in a second. But you have to think about that. The idea behind Bitcoin is that every user not necessarily must, but at least can run his or her own node, the own Bitcoin software on his or her own computer. And this is usually also done by a lot of people. So there are hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin nodes out there. There's only 18,000 Bitcoin nodes visible because they are connected to the Clearnet. Clearnet is the standard, the standard internet, and there is some encapsulated layer behind that is not clearly visible. So the countable number of nodes is 18,000 something, but they're much more than that underlying. So these are the nodes, and the node's core purpose is to replicate the underlying data. And what is the data? It's very simple. You have a bunch of Bitcoin transactions in this network. They are in blocks. On average, every 10 minutes, there's a new block containing a number of thousands of transactions, and these nodes store these blocks. A block is about 2 megabytes large, so it's a storage mechanism, and this storage is distributed amongst all node operators. Yeah, and that's the node setup in particular. So then, beside the nodes, you have obviously the hodlers, or the ecosystem is calling their investors. So they are called hodlers because they hold Bitcoin. And they basically just own the coin. Obviously, there are node operators that are hodlers and vice versa. But you not necessarily have to run a node to hold some Bitcoin. So then there's the miners. Miners are a very specific type of group in the Bitcoin ecosystem because they often it's said that they validate transactions, but this is not purely the case. They rather build specific blocks out of the mempool, which is, all these, I mentioned these transactions that are part of a new block. And the question is, who decides what will be part, which transaction will be part of the next block? And this process is solved in a very decentralized and distributed manner via miners. We could elaborate deeper on the purpose of miners, but they solve a hash puzzle, which is not a complex equation or algorithm, or not a complex task, but they run it in very often, like hundreds of trillion times. They have these operations which are quite power intensive. And by that, if you hit this specific task result, which is then you are with this hash, you're allowed to publish the next block and use the transactions you decide to introduce in your block, introduce them and publish to the network. And then this block is distributed amongst all nodes in the network. Yeah. And obviously the miner decides for the fees included in the transactions, which will be imputed. So the higher the fee of the transaction, the higher the likelihood that the miner will include it in his or her block.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So economic incentives are driving and mathematicism.
Yes, exactly.
So you have the nodes, you have the miners, you have the hodlers. What role do the core developers have when teaming?
Yeah. So obviously Bitcoin is not a system that remains still since 15 years, right? We are approaching Bitcoin version 20. And this means obviously there has been major changes to the system. But though the core parts of the software were basically completely rewritten since Satoshi published the very first version back then, the core idea and the core principles remain more or less the same. So the core developers change code, they improve code, and this is the idea. Everyone can contribute to the Bitcoin development because open source development, but there are a handful of core developers who have these specific rights to the Bitcoin core repository and can push the changes. But even if, and this is always the question that follows, right? Even if some malicious changes would be pushed, the core developers are not who can change the system. They change the software, but they can't change the running Bitcoin system because to any change to be effective, the node operators must run the new version of the software.
How do they decide which version to run? Single operators? Because you have the code developers are understood. There's something called Bitcoin Twitter as well, so people influencing in the ecosystem. Are there any influences or centralization parts in there in terms of opinion building? Or how do the node operator decide which software update to run on which or not?
So yeah, typically it is not recommended to run your node in auto version mode, which means that you upgrade to a new version manually after you've checked the changes. This I know this sounds complicated, but in the end, you just check out the release notes and say, okay, these was the changes, and it makes sense for me to upgrade or not. Usually, node operators are people who are a bit tech savvy, so they have an understanding. Okay, these changes make sense, and like you mentioned, there's a community over several forums, not on Twitter, but also Twitter, of course, where you have already a lot of discussion regarding upcoming changes. And it is not like the core developers they have a fancy idea and they push that, and after a week you have a completely software module in there.
Mm-hmm.
This is by far not the process. It's the most conservative software change life cycle that I've seen in my whole career.
Okay.
Yeah, because changes are proposed, then they're iterated, then their potential solution is implemented, then again discussed, then improved after a couple of circles of feedback loops, right? And after then really implemented and then pushed to, even then in the end, if everything works well, every side effect is considered, and only if it is expected that it really will be in the favor of the majority of the network, only then and commit is actually pushed through to the main branch and the repository. Yeah. So the hurdles are very high, and it is not uncommon that Bitcoin improvement proposals take years. And you could argue that it's a bug, that's a problem for the community because you can't change or adapt to quick changes. But certainly it's a feature because you have a stable system, right? Mm-hmm. It's much, much more important than if you have a fancy crypto fintech. You want to have immediate changes, you want to have like super fast communication, you want to have like fast changes in the software. But this is not for Bitcoiners, right? Bitcoiners say, okay, we are responsible for a market capitalization of over $2 trillion US. Yeah. Or like Bitcoiners would say, almost now 19.6 or 19.7 million Bitcoin. And we have the responsibility that we only push stuff that is really improving the protocol and is in favor of the majority. One last very important thing, not by a handful of Bitcoin core developers. This is very important to understand. It is not by a couple of miners or even mining pools. It is always a democratic decision by the majority of node operators if a change is adopted or not. Yeah, and we have seen things in the block size wars a couple of years ago. We have seen the case that the majority of the network actually decided to not adopt features that would be available, like the larger block debate. Mm-hmm. For the very simple reason that would have made the system more exclusive to larger node operators, and it would have excluded smaller node operators, which was not really a democratic thing to do.
Yeah. I think the fear was also that the miners had too much power. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this, because you said they decide which transactions they take out of the mempool and take into the block. Should they decide which transactions? Why is the system still bulletproof?
And yeah, so miners actually themselves thought that they are running the system, mm-hmm. and they actually were proven wrong. The block size wars back then have proven the miners wrong. They have no say in it when it comes to governance. They are, of course, an integral and important part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, but they're not determining the majority's will how Bitcoin is actually looks like. They are incentivized by new block rewards, like generating new blocks, and they're incentivized by the fees within the transactions. Mm-hmm. But in the end, they have no really. Like, you can argue that they have no say, because in the end, if you have transactions that are high, mm-hmm. even if a certain miner or mining pool does not like this transaction, then the next block will be mined by another miner or another pool, which has a decent fee, and then it's mined. So you can't censor by that. And the mining power by that is quite limited.
Yeah, cool. So, yeah, it's the beauty of decentralization, right? To think once takes it.
Yeah, and also through market, right?
Yeah. Maybe we can dive a little deeper into Bitcoin's consensus mechanism and its integrity. So it's proof of work. And what is so fascinating about proof of work?
Mm-hmm. Well, so most people think it is solving a complex task or complex algorithm or mathematical question, which is not the case. It's neither very complex, nor is that the core purpose of proof of work. Actually, the core purpose of proof of work is finding a timestamp in a decentralized system. Because when you have a decentralized system, you can't ask in a system what is the time right now. Because no one can answer you the time independently. So when I ask you what is the time, I don't know whether you tell me the true time or not.
Yeah.
And if you have a decentralized network, who knows what will be the right time? And this timing aspect is so important because when you have an order of transaction, the timing aspect is super important and the order is super important. This is also one of the reasons why you don't have a block every 2 seconds, but instead an average of 10 minutes. And how to maintain these average 10 minutes is done by difficulty adjustments, which is part of the overall consensus setup here, because it is critical that these 10 minutes on average are dealt with or are kept. And it's done by the so-called difficulty adjustment, which is increasing the difficulty whenever the time between the blocks gets too short. And this is relevant when new hash rate, new miners add to the system, right? And we've seen that all the time. Also, it's on all-time high because probably for several reasons. One is that the BRICS Plus also announced earlier this year that they start mining and start investing in mining infrastructure as well. But it certainly it is within a quite high Bitcoin price. It makes more and more sense to mine at decent energy costs. Not obviously in the European regions where energy costs are usually like more than 20 cents European-wide, or even like 40 cents in Germany. But for most countries that have access to clean and cheap energy, like especially hydropower, it makes a lot of sense. And so this difficulty adjustment is part of this network, but the consensus itself is the core purpose of proof of work is to find an order of time. And proof of work, I have to say that as well to really cover your question, what is proof of work and what makes it special? This process thermodynamically secures the connected transactions in the blocks. This is very important because if you have not this energy as a secure work or a secure proof, then what else you have? Like other chains usually work with a political consensus algorithm, with which most of the time is a proof of stake, which usually is the more token you have, the more you have to say in the network. So it's doomed to become more and more centralized, of course, because the more interest you earn, the more stake you have, the more you have to say. And this group, different story with proof of work, because it is simply the energy on an underlying transaction or underlying block.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Can you also talk about the incentive for a miner actually to do this task is the transaction fee as well as the block reward, I think it's called. But this is halving. So it's going down. Can you talk a little bit about this? Well, why is that? And will the incentives stay up to actually keep mining blocks when the system?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is the halving works like that every 4 years, or to be precise, every 210,000 blocks, which is a small deviation here. The block rewards is halved by 2, or it's basically divided by 2, it's halved, for the very simple reason that this is the whole issuance schedule of Bitcoin. So you have the whole amount of halvings, and the 21 million Bitcoin, close to 21 million Bitcoin that will be in circulation, are not issued by this hard cap of 21 million. You won't find this 21 million in the code. of Bitcoin. For a very simple reason, because it's the underlying algorithm that every 4 years, the rewards which started at 50 is halved 50 Bitcoin in the first epoch. That was basically when Bitcoin started. And is halved in the second epoch to 25, and also halved in the third epoch to 12.5, etc. And, what does that mean? No one, well, it's hard to get the meaning, right? That it actually means that by the year 2030, 99% of all Bitcoin will be allocated, and hence only 1% of Bitcoin is remaining.
Really? And how does the incentive for the miners stay up? Just through the transaction fees, or how do they finance their mining operations?
So first of all, the block reward, which is paid in Bitcoin, obviously, is increased in value by, if you measure that from a fiat perspective. Okay.
Yeah.
So since the Bitcoin price has significantly increased, you could argue that fiat decreased, not Bitcoin increased, but fiat decreased. That's a better discussion for another day. But it is true that the miners measured in fiat are able to pay more bills. They pay higher energy bills, for instance, and invest in new hardware because the Bitcoin price in fiat were actually rising. At the same time, the fees also increased a lot on the mainnet. So typically you see around $5 for a mainnet transaction right now, like the plain vanilla transaction, which it is a decent price, but not too crazy if you consider it that you have these like an internal transaction. My perception is not $5 for a transaction that is eternal, which is forever in the blockchain. Quite good price actually. But you also can argue that this price is too high for a day-to-day transaction. Then we have to talk about Lightning Network. Different route. We have to take that as well for a different interview, I would say. But the idea is that the miners are for increasing Bitcoin price and an increasing fee schedule or increasing fees by the users, they are optimized. And this will be the case when Bitcoin is completely issued. So often people ask me, what is happening when in the year 2140, when the last Bitcoin is mined, what the miner will do?
Really?
Yeah, they still mine, they earn just fees.
Really?